Welcome everyone. I'm delighted to kick off our first panel session today. I'm Zoe Metcalfe from AtkinsRealis, and we're here to talk about building for a challenging future, the role of transport infrastructure in delivering climate and nature-friendly environments for society. I'm joined by Professor Phil Blythe on my left from DARE. Phil also was the Chief Scientific Advisor for Department of Transport. And Phil will kick off fairly shortly with an introduction and share some of the insights and learning from DARE as the Decarbonomics Adaptable and Resilient Transport Infrastructure Research and Innovation Hub. To my left, I'm joined by Steve Elderkin, Director of Environmental Sustainability at National Highways, and Steve too will talk further about rebuilding with nature. And then to my right, I'm delighted to be joined by Matt on the far right from WSP, and Matt will talk a little bit more about himself from a personal perspective and his role here as we move through the session today. Rachel, likewise, from Ramboll, will also bring to life her own purpose-driven perspective in the role of nature and transport. And finally, to Matt from WSP, who will also... James from Amey, similarly. So let me set a little bit of context in this to kick the panel off. So we're living in a time of deep complexity and uncertainty, and as a number of you would have heard from Andy Burnham earlier today, transport infrastructure is absolutely key to driving our inclusive socio-economic growth, and transport is also key to our own health and well-being creation. Nature has a vital role to play in this delivery of effective transport in terms of we've seen the impacts of climate change really undermining our ability of our highway infrastructure and our rail infrastructure to perform effectively. We're seeing frequency of failure, and we're seeing that have an impact on fragmenting the overarching infrastructure. We know that if we take an opportunity to look at landscape regeneration and look at highway corridors and railway corridors alongside revitalizing nature, there are possibilities to make a win for nature, a win for transport, and also for agriculture. And I wish actually we had a farmer sitting on our panel today who could actively talk about the benefits of looking at this in a joined-up way. I'd like to invite Phil now to take a position at the podium to really talk from the perspective of decarbonomics, decarbonisation and resilience as a starting point to scene set, and bring to life some of the trilemmas.
Okay. Thank you, Zoe. Delighted to be here. As I say, my name's Phil Blythe. I'm Professor of Intelligent Transport Systems at Newcastle University, and was previously the Chief Scientific Advisor at DFT until 2021. What I'm talking about today is a national hub that's being co-funded by the Research Councils, UKRI, and the Department for Transport, along with their arm's-length bodies, known as DARE, Decarbonised, Adaptive and Resilient Transport Infrastructures. And that's been established to really look at that trilemma of how do we ensure that we're decarbonising our transport infrastructure, both when we build it and when we maintain it and look after it. Make sure that we are understanding what the challenges are from climate change and extreme weather, and how we have to adapt our transport infrastructure and the transport systems and services and the communities that use that and the society that uses that. And also looking at the resilience of transport infrastructures. And that's really challenging, because it's not always necessary that all three of those align and go in the same direction. And it's also interesting that from a government point of view and from a national point of view, it's the resilience that feels like it is being left behind in terms of its thinking. And resilience doesn't mean that you build infrastructure that will never fail. You've got to make it very, very robust to do that. Although there are some infrastructures that you want to make sure that is the case, because they're absolutely critical to the economic lifeline and for society. But most infrastructures will be built to a certain level of resilience, and above that, they may fail due to extremes of climate. And that's really challenging, because When they do fail, we don't really think about the whole life cost and the extended cost of what does that actually mean for the country. So we have some case studies looking at a failure of a viaduct, Plessy Viaduct outside of Newcastle. And although that was looking at what did that mean for all those journeys that didn't happen, all those journeys that were late, all that freight that couldn't be moved. But when you actually looked at the wider impact, it was impacting on railway operations down in the southwest. It was impacting on the economic heart of Newcastle and the like, because trains couldn't get there. And what we're trying to do is build a decision support framework which will look at all these challenges and bring them together. And the reason that's important, if you think about the last year, you think about Valencia, you think about that flooding in Central Europe, where Poland actually evacuated several cities. You think about similar extremes around the world caused by rain, caused by heat, caused by wind. Now, at the moment, we have certain predictions about how the extremes of weather are going to get worse due to climate. But the new models that some of my team at the university, along with the Met Office, are actually working on, are suggesting that those climate extremes are going to come sooner, they're going to come harder, and they're going to come more frequent. So whereas if you had a failure of a railway infrastructure or a road infrastructure once every 10 years, you probably just absorb that, rebuild, get the performance back to normal, and continue. But what happens if that infrastructure, because of the extremes of weather, is failing every couple of years or every year or several times a year? The mindset of what you do has got to be very, very different. So part of what we're trying to do is look at case studies, look at the weather predictions, and actually look at how can we understand what levels of resilience we need in the future to ensure that the majority of our transport infrastructure can perform for the majority of the time. And if it does fail, it's recovered quickly. Now, that's not going to work for every piece of infrastructure. Some are going to not be repaired quickly and recover quickly, and others are just, quite frankly, in the wrong place, and you may have to make a decision to let that fail. And one classic example near to here is Snake Pass between Manchester and Sheffield, continually getting landslides due to wet weather, due to very hot weather, and I think Derbyshire County Council decided they cannot dedicate their entire road maintenance budget to keep that road operating for cars. So we're trying to look at the challenges around what do we mean by resilience, also modeling communities, modeling the environment, doing a lot of agent-based modeling to actually understand how communities, how society are affected by these extremes and how they can recover and adapt so they can continue. And that's really, really important. And although we're not focusing primarily on nature-based solutions and primarily on the concern about biodiversity, that's all within the mix. But one of the challenges we have is, as I say, we've got this trilemma thinking about how do we decarbonize our infrastructures, which is really, really important, because the less carbon we put in the air, the less the extremes of climate change should be. How do we adapt and how do we make it resilient? But some of those things aren't necessarily as I say, always aligned. So we think about the move towards electrification, which is great. As long as you've got clean, green electricity, electrification is great because it means you're not going to have any tailpipe emissions in your vehicles, road vehicles, in your trains and in your aircraft in the future. But there's also the challenge of whether the reliance on a new energy vector, i.e. electricity, will actually make our transport systems and the infrastructure more or less resilient. It means that if we have failures in electricity, our transport network goes down, there may not be alternatives. Petrol, diesel, a bit more portable for moving around if there's issues with accessibility due to flooding or failure of infrastructure. So these are the sort of balances we're trying to develop a decision support model for the department to consider. Another one, classic example, is we can decarbonize by looking at these wonderful new materials we're developing, which contain much, much less carbon in their manufacture. And that's great because, again, when you build infrastructures, when you maintain infrastructures, you're using less carbon. The challenge is for the industry, and this is a big challenge at the moment, is we don't fully understand how long these new materials will last. Are they as performant and will perform for as long as standard concrete, steel, bitumen, etc., or will they fail sooner? So we're solving the decarb problem by using these materials, but not necessarily the resilience problem because they may not have the same performance. So we're kicking off a big piece of work on behalf of DFT with the Institute of Civil Engineers to look at this over the period. So it's super complicated, and we're using a sort of systems of systems approach to try and understand how do we deliver on decarbonisation, which is one that everybody's been looking at and is really important. But how do we look at adaptation? You know, if we fail with giving the opportunities to adapt, well, communities will fail. Communities may choose not to use certain transport modes, particularly active travel modes, if for a period of parts of the period of the year they can't use them because of extremes of weather. And if we can't make our transport infrastructure resilient, we've got massive challenges. The biggest problem is the cost associated with this is really, really high. So local governments, regional authorities, mayoral authorities, and national government are going to have a decision framework which will help them make decisions about where their priorities will be. And sadly, that may mean at times that certain infrastructures will be left because you cannot afford to repair them all the time, and you may have to move them and just let them decline. And that's a really bad thing, but at the same time, I think the reality of climate change will begin to kick in more, and those decisions will have to be made. And sadly, societies around the world, since we came out of the swamp as human beings, have built our infrastructures, built our cities, built our communities, built our economies around water, whether that be rivers, estuaries, or the sea. And unfortunately, that is in many cases where the extremes become more apparent with increases in sea level and the fact that water runs towards the sea and runs down rivers. So some massive challenges there. So as I say, working with the arm's length bodies, working with the DFT to try and pull a decision framework together based on a whole bunch of integrated modelling we're doing, looking at agent-based models, looking at weather models, looking at economic models, to actually try and inform the department on the decisions they have to make in the future. But it's going to be tough. And a priority at a regional level to maintain a piece of infrastructure may not be the same priority at the local level where they're worried about something else, or at the national level where they have a more strategic view. And it's also important to make sure that transport doesn't exist in a vacuum. We've got to think about other infrastructures that we rely on, and particularly the energy infrastructures, electricity, the communications and ICT infrastructures. And quite often all those run down the same corridors, run across the same bridges on our roads. And we've got to make sure that we understand the implications of a failure of a piece of infrastructure, which may wipe out massive amounts of what we need to have an economy and have a functioning society. And I know that all sounds like doom and gloom, which to some extent it is, but we can get through this. We can begin to rationalize the decisions that need to be made, where the money needs to be focused and the like. But I think we all have to do our bit to understand how we can reduce emissions and try and reduce our impacts of climate change. But doing our bit also involves possibly not building on floodplains and not building in certain areas because, quite frankly, they are going to become non-viable areas in the future. And that also impacts on the nature-based solutions about how we design infrastructure that doesn't cut across existing watercourses and runoffs, for example, and also how it will impact on nature if we build infrastructure in certain places. What I would say about DARE is one of the real strengths of it is its convening power to bring entities, to bring stakeholders together, to bring government from different departments together to really look at these problems in detail. And DARE's always looking for new stakeholders to join us, to be part of the conversation and help us really look at these massively complicated problems. And, you know, we're just under halfway through the 41 months, bizarre length of time for the project. And I think we've got all the building blocks and foundations now in place so we can look at those big ticket questions. The DFT and their arm's length body gave us 14 strategic questions they wanted answers to understand the whole decarbonisation of infrastructure, the adaptation and the resilience of infrastructure. We can deal with about half of them, and we're going to convene some meetings to look at some of those really challenging strategic questions. But the important thing is we've got to move with pace. We can't just sit back and let things happen to us. We've got to actually start thinking about how we mobilize society, how we mobilize government, how how we inform the local authorities and the regional authorities so they can make the best long-term decisions to achieve that decarbonised adaptation and resilience of our transport infrastructure. Because without that, the transport systems and services cannot run, and we are in big problems. So happy to cover more of that later, but I think that's enough for now. Zoe, as a taster. Okay.
That's fabulous, fabulous. So really, just to really summarise, Phil, what you're really advocating for there is that the need to bring resilience upstream into our thinking. And there's a real opportunity potentially with devolution to look at that at a regional scale. That we need to consider a transformation around our operational approaches to plan for, decline of some of those assets and infrastructure. And clearly this emphasis on partnership, partnership working around shared problems and solutions. The aspect there is shifting mindsets, and I just wondered whether there is areas where you're seeing resistance to that shift that needs to take around the mindset.
I think everybody recognises there's a problem, and I think last year was a classic example that we're beginning to see extremes of climate change hitting Western cities in a way that haven't before. You think about what happened in Valencia. You think about, if we don't get that right, who's going to insure anything going forward? Government will be the insurer of last resort. There was 10, 12,000 cars destroyed in Valencia. That's all a hit on the insurance company. They're not going to say insure part of that again because they can't afford to continue taking the hit. So there's a whole massive shift in that mindset, but I think if we get it right and have a national mission to do that, I think we can be a leader in that and obviously export our expertise and our thinking elsewhere. If we get it wrong, we're going to be just sticking plaster patches here, there, and there. This fails, we rebuild. That fails, it rebuilds. Oh, that's failed 4 times. We're just going to leave it. And that's not really where we want to be. We want to be ahead of the curve. But when you look at the predictions of where the extremes of climate weather are coming, how extreme they're going to be and how frequent they may be, in combinations of heat, wind, rain, our infrastructures were never designed to deal with that. So we really need to have that conversation and take it very seriously. And as you say, the regions, they know their region, they know the problems, they know where the recurring issues are, and so they're far better placed to deal with that than national government. National government can provide the thought leadership and the guidance and the regulations to make it happen, but regional governments are the ones. I mean, I'm from the northeast. We've had a massive failure of infrastructure, a massive failure, and yet 90% of the people I've spoken to here have never heard of it. Our entire flyover that delivers traffic to the Tyne Bridge from the south failed before Christmas. It's going to have to be demolished. So that's something like 60,000 cars a day haven't got anywhere to go. And that's due to a combination of failed concrete, impact of climate change and everything else. If we think about these things happening elsewhere, if it happened in the southeast rather than northeast, it would be in the news, but it's the northeast, no one cares. But these are significant impacts. It stopped the metro running because we're worried that this overpass is going to collapse onto the metro tunnels underneath. These are big issues, and at the moment we're not seeing them that much in the UK, but there's no reason not to think that they will be raised in the very near future.
Great, thank you, Phil. Come and take a seat.
Thank you.
I'm just going to move on to really bringing nature. What's nature's role in this challenge around enabling our infrastructure to be truly resilient, but also drive inclusive growth? So, Steve, if I ask you to step up, I'm going to give an example briefly of an area where this is being realised. So there may be, some of you may be aware of an initiative by Network Rail called Trees and Trains. And in England, this was looking at how could we deliver increased biodiversity net gain, how could we deliver climate resilience of the railway by looking at the relationship of the railway with the landscape. And there are 2 demonstrators going on, one in the northeast Cotswolds area, another in Chipping Sodbury, that is working with large group of farmers to look at the landscape, look at the hydrology, look at how you can integrate landscape habitat changes to enable the land to act as a natural reservoir and hold on to water, prevent that water from, say, eroding your Victorian embankment, but look at those multiple benefits around natural capital as well and carbon sequestration. And that's live work that's going on that's requiring a partnership approach. So it's Thames Water, Environment Agency, the farmers, and Network Rail and Forestry England all working together with a shared problem and therefore a shared opportunity to solve it. Now, it's a tiny element of railway infrastructure, but it's a low-cost solution to enabling that railway infrastructure to gain greater resilience. It also precludes people from having to actually go and repair a Victorian embankment and be working alongside a live operational rail. Now, that's not applicable everywhere, but I just wanted to highlight that there is an element of looking and thinking differently about nature. And I'm going to segue now to Steve, who's really going to talk a little bit more about the opportunity with rebuilding with nature. So, Steve.
Great, thank you. Good morning, everyone. So, I'm going to try and persuade you that we can and we should rebuild nature. And partly it's because of what nature can do for us as infrastructure sector and the resilience it can offer, but actually it's partly because we've got a key role in nature recovery and nature matters, and it should matter to all of us. So why does nature matter? It feels a bit patronising to raise the question, but I was talking earlier and with a couple of people. Not everyone quite gets it, how absolutely fundamental nature is to the health and prosperity of our economy and our society. So we need nature to store the carbon in its soil and in its trees. We need the materials that nature provides. We need the nutrients and the food. We get health and well-being benefits from being out in nature. We are not apart from nature. We are embedded in it. The whole economy, as the Dasgupta review concluded, is absolutely embedded in nature. You cannot have a thriving and prosperous society without a thriving natural environment. And the figures are challenging when you look at it. So since 1970, there's been a collapse in biodiversity in the health of populations. And we know what we need to do to reverse that decline in nature. The Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Protocol that was agreed a couple of years ago, Article 3 talks about protecting 30% of land and sea for nature as reservoirs for biological complexity, as a store of a resilient and robust and muscular life that can survive threats and insults and the greater challenges that a changing climate will bring. Article 3, importantly, doesn't just say you need to protect 30% of land, it says it needs to be well connected. And part of the cause of the decline of biodiversity and the loss of species is, yes, the loss of habitat, yes, the deterioration of that habitat, but it's also the fact that it's becoming fragmented. And fragmented habitat can only support small populations, and those small populations are vulnerable to collapse. You have a disease, you have a climatic event, and then actually that whole population collapses. There is no reservoir of large population from which to restock. So the connectivity of habitat really matters. The Lawton Review, back in 2010, so it was a coalition government review, came up with a prescription for nature recovery, and it was quite straightforward. We need more, bigger, better, and joined up habitat. So we know what we need to do. It's really quite simple. And as a gardener, I spend a lot of time in the garden. You don't spend your time polishing the flowers. You spend your time looking after the soil. And then if the soil is in good health, good stuff will happen in the garden. And I think it's very much the same in nature recovery. If we create the habitat that's well connected, large enough, you're going to get good stuff happening for nature. So if we're going to realise this prescription and do this thing that is of existential importance for us, then we need a strategic nature network. We need big, large core areas of habitat. We need them to be connected up. And what I would like to see is a bold and ambitious vision for nature recovery and a statement that we are together going to create this strategic nature network at a national scale. coming to a town near you, accessible for all, giving you that access to green space. But actually, we see that there are nationally significant core areas of habitat and nationally significant connecting corridors for nature. Just as there's a strategic road network, we should have a strategic nature network. I think this is vital national infrastructure. And if you're going to realise it, actually, you need to have it, approach it in the same way as you would a government major programme. So who is the delivery body that sees natural infrastructure as their core delivery purpose? I'll leave that hanging. So it's a bit about what nature can do for transport. Yes, absolutely. Nature-based flood management is essential if we're going to get prepared for a wetter future. So the Environment Agency published its latest National Flood Risk Assessment just before Christmas. Something like half of roads will be vulnerable to flooding by 2050, up by a third from the current position. 93% of the drainage across the National Highways network was built before 2006, before we upgraded the capacity in our standards to deal with wetter weather. So we are not going to have the money, and we are not going to have the customer willingness for us to dig up 93% of our hard engineering asset and increase the capacity of our drains. It is just not going to happen. So the only way that we can approach this is in a hybrid way and take the opportunities that Zoe talked about for nature to help us make our infrastructure more resilient. And that's true too for rail, and it's true too for local highways, and it's true for other infrastructure too. We need a national programme for nature-based flood management. Again, it could be part of a strategic network and part of how you guide which areas you see as important for that network. But it's also about what can transport do for nature. So historically, we have delivered our infrastructure without too much concern for the habitat that we have been severing through the construction of our roads. So I live near Canterbury in Kent. There is a Blean Woods around Canterbury, which would be the largest ancient woodland in England if it was all connected. But the A2 goes straight through the middle of it and severs it, and that was built many years ago. This bridge, does this work? There we go. This bridge is currently under construction near the M25 Junction 10 scheme. This road is the A3, and that was built in the early 1970s. 50 years ago, just as in the Blean near where I live, that severed this large area of heathland. And now both sides of the A3 are triple SIs for heathland. And brilliantly, members of my team, the project team spotted the opportunity. While we were on site upgrading the junction here, we would construct what will be one of the two largest green bridges in the UK. And this is 70 metres long, 30 metres wide, and will provide both active travel and recreational access, but it will provide a wide enough strip that species will be able to intermingle and cross. And 50 years after it was severed, we have once again connected habitat either side of the A3. And I don't know if you've driven there, it's near the M25, it feels very built up, but actually when you zoom out, you realise just how big an area of habitat there is either side and how important this junction is. That's great. It was done because everything fell into place. There happened to be some designated funds available. There happened to be some really passionate individuals that drove this structure through. But this is not an answer to systematically addressing nature severance across the whole of the UK. The Dutch took a much more top-down, rational approach. So they did some analysis, they identified 170-odd locations where nature severance was most significant, and then they put €500 million into their national infrastructure programme. They built 80 green bridges, addressed all but about 20 of those severance points, with a 15-year infrastructure programme. Multi-annual defragmentation programme was the catchy title. I would like us to do the same. So just give me £1 or £2 billion. I think we could do a lot to help on the recovery of nature in the UK. Now, clearly we need bigger core areas, we need nature investment zones. There are other instruments that might incentivise the habitat side of it, but I think the connectivity is a key enabler that only the transport sector can provide. And this should be a core mission for us as a sector in the next decade. I'm going on beyond my time. So this is a nature-led massive infrastructure programme. I would like to see it led by somebody of a delivery mindset from the infrastructure sector. I think it can offer us resilience, it can offer us health, it can offer us prosperity. I think it's vital. If you go to www.rebuildingnature.com, you can add your voice to making this a reality. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. So, Steve, do you think we need to get better at being able to articulate the value of nature in terms of really, creating the scorecards around nature, and similarly, as Phil was highlighting earlier, also valuing the risk, when we push the costs downstream?
So I'm a bit torn on it. I think nature is so fundamental that trying to structure by structure do a cost-benefit analysis where you measure the marginal improvement in nature's resilience, and you are going to struggle. And if we try and do this structure by structure, we will fail. With the odd opportunity, like the bridge that I've just talked about, will come to pass, but we will not get a systematic approach. You talk to the Dutch academics and the people from the ministry there. They said basically their cost-benefit analysis was, we cannot achieve our nature objectives without doing this. We are now looking at the most cost-effective way to connect nature up enough. We are then going to address those with the best design solutions in those locations. We are not going to bother with trying to do a cost-benefit analysis, a full monetisation of the benefits of doing this. It's so fundamental. We should just get on and do this. And to just put it in context, $2 billion. It sounds quite a lot to ask for a connectivity program. That's just over 2 kilometres of HS2. Yeah. So, and nature is more fundamental than saving 10 minutes on your journey to Birmingham. This is fundamental, and it shouldn't be that difficult to make the case. And again, if you've got the strategic vision, then you can allocate that money to the most cost-effective places, and you avoid the kind of issues that we've had with batshit crazy ideas that some have found to be a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have to say, in my own conversations, I think the private sector really wants to step forward into playing a role in terms of investing in nature, in climate resilience, and certainly large-scale projects that connect and improve highway infrastructure, rail infrastructure, canals and rivers, as well in nature, are highly attractive. And so there's a real opportunity for us to rethink how we deliver and who's in that partnership with us. Right, I'm going to move on, and I'm going to come to Rachel next, having heard our speakers already, to really sort of bring to life from your own perspective a project and a case story, as it were, around these themes. But I know first, tell us why you're here today.
Thank you. Yes, well, I was invited, so that's why I'm here. But yes, I work for Ramboll, so we're design engineers. And just to give a bit of background, I've worked in the engineering profession for over 30 years now. So I've worked in more of the sort of external-facing sector, working for sort of corporate organisations to set strategy around environmental and sustainability strategy. What does that mean? What are the priority areas? And then to help them understand what the target should be, who should be set in terms of roles and responsibilities and action plans, but very much at that corporate level. 18 months ago, I've moved to Ramboll, and I moved into the transport market. So I've gone into more of a focused role around implementing sustainability into design. So what's been eye-opening for me is my ability to influence that corporate piece has changed. So the ambition and the location of a development and the ambition around that development is largely set when we come in as design engineers. We might have an outline design, which we then have to take to kind of detailed design, but we're very much trying to implement sustainability. So I was going to give an example around that, which is a park and ride scheme which we were working on, which is down in the Oxfordshire area. And it's really the story of a tree. So what this is about is, because we do a lot of training of the engineers around sustainability and the importance of sustainability into design, we got the outline design for this. It was a park and ride scheme. It had an integrated bus lane, and it had some active travel facilities. Fantastic. But when our engineers went to the site for a site visit, and they looked at what was actually there, there was a tree and a set of trees which were mature, and within the outline design, they were being taken down. And the engineer, luckily, kind of went, what if we could? What if we could do something different? So went back to the desk and looked at the whole outline strategy and looked at different options around this. So the outcome of that scheme was that originally, the original earth-moving strategy was to remove 80,000 cubic metres of earth off-site. We redesigned based on the existing topography, so we could keep the trees, keep a number of hedgerows, and then the balance of material that needed to be moved off-site was moved to near zero. So fantastic achievement. Also, it meant that the mindset around, can we retain trees and hedgerows? Can we think about the biodiversity in a different way? Can we enhance that biodiversity? Was really brought to light in the design. We also looked at revising the types of materials and volumes of materials. So we actually saved 20% in terms of the actual carbon within the design as well. Increased the landscape and ecological planting area and diversity. So we had happy engineers because they were doing something slightly different. We had a happy client. We had a happy community and happy nature as well.
And did you find with that approach that you also were able to capture some capital savings for the client, where you were therefore, no longer moving such vast amounts of earth,
exactly. So, often we get asked the question, does sustainability cost?
Yeah.
Just to address that one, in terms of saving, 80,000 cubic metres of material not moving off-site, the cost of that was a significant saving.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yes, and it'd be interesting to know some of the less tangible impacts of that around safeguarding such key features like trees, in terms of the role they play culturally for communities as well, because often they play a key role in terms of identifying place. So it'd be interesting to know whether there's, once it's being occupied and used, what the beneficiaries' experience of it is. Yeah, thank you. Can I come to you, Matt, now?
Thanks for having me. So similarly, why am I here? I'm actually an ecologist by trade. So whilst it's been quite a number of years I've been out in the field doing sort of ecological day-to-day work, I've moved around in my career, and I've always retained that interest in ecology. I did a zoology degree, and by definition, ecology is all about how organisms interact with each other and their surroundings. And as I've got more and more involved in significant infrastructure projects, I've always been interested in how do those infrastructure projects interact with their surroundings, how do they interact with the organisms that they impact, and then vice versa. So for the purpose of this discussion, I'm interested in that vice versa. So how do we understand the interaction and interfaces between infrastructure and nature, and how do we, if we think about leveraging the benefits of that nature on the infrastructure assets that sit in that landscape? But that doesn't, as we've been here, that doesn't come easily, and I'm in the privileged position to work on some major infrastructure projects, to spend quite a lot of time with infrastructure owner clients, and understand the kind of the barriers, both sort of commercially, culturally, economically, in changing the mind shift of how we deliver, operate, and maintain infrastructure, and embed nature-based solutions as part of that.
Great, thank you, Matt. James, I'm now going to come to you.
Good morning, everyone. James from Amey. So I lead the energy transition and sustainability business at Amey. We have a consulting business. We also have a large operations and maintenance business, and all within the same organisation. And I've become really quite fascinated with how do we use what we have today to deliver more for nature, and how can, as Matt and others have said, how can nature deliver more for infrastructure if we marry the two together more closely. And this, of course, is against the backdrop of huge fiscal pressure at the moment. It would be brilliant if we could have 2, 4, 6 billion pounds to invest. The reality that I feel on a daily basis is very tight. There's lots of pressure politically for defence spend, etc., etc., etc. So I'm really quite interested in, with what we have today as a pound going into our infrastructure assets, what more can we do with it? And to unpack that a little bit, I'd like to talk to you about otters, because you probably want to hear about nature. So, and this is a live project that we're doing, and actually we've been commissioned to look into otter mortality, so which is tragic. Otters being killed on the road network. And our study's been really, really quite interesting. So we've used a load of digital tools, done mapping of mortalities across the network over a period of time, and looked at various hotspots. And what we're actually finding is that it's about much, much more than just otter mortality. So where there's mortality, there's also a huge safety risk for drivers, and there have been a number of accidents in those locations. And then you start digging a bit deeper into the data, and you think, so why are otters crossing the carriageway at that location? And my team's going out to these sites and assessing them. And what they're finding is invariably there's blocked culverts. So the otters would have used culverts to cross. The culverts are blocked, which of course is a drainage issue as well. And then there are separate teams then that will be looking at maintenance, which will then be assessing drainage. So all of a sudden you've got this system really. So nature is telling us something, but it's impacting many, many, many different things. And if we can marry nature more closely to the heart of the operational and the maintenance solution, we can learn from nature, we could save lives, and we could be more efficient, all within the same pound that we already have. So I'm just interested in exploring that a bit more as well.
Wow, I never expected that when you led with, my focus on energy, that we've moved to otters. But I think that's really interesting, that connection between otter health and our health as well. Is really, really compelling. The other thing that strikes me, picking up what Rachel and Matt both said, is around the fact that the role of the transport planner engineer is radically changing in terms of advising and changing our clients' decision-making early on, but also as a systems thinker. I mean, if I think, years ago when I worked on Tottenham Hotspur football stadium and the master plan, it was all trip data. It was very binary in a sense, but we're now asking planners and engineers, we're not asking, but it seems that naturally having to shift into this systems thinking place. Are you seeing that for yourselves?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's why I, was brought on into Ramboll, because, the role was created to help with that systems thinking piece, really, to drive that sustainability into design. And Ramboll's got a very strong sustainability strategy, and this is what often, we find with organisations. You have a strong sustainability strategy at the highest level, and then driving that down into projects and developments, it all becomes a little bit non-existent often. So the approach to that has been, I've worked very much on sort of driving process and procedure into engineering design. So things such as we've set sustainability review forms at a discipline level. So I'm talking to a bridge engineer, I'm talking to a drainage engineer about what can they do on sustainability, helping them understand that they have a role in it. And that's around the materials that they're using, and an understanding of what the carbon means for that material versus that material. So steel versus wood versus concrete, and the types of concrete, getting down to that sort of level, so that they can make the decisions for themselves. Because I'm sort of one person with a team of people trying to drive that, and also putting the sort of language of sustainability into engineering terms as well. So where we look at value engineering and we're looking at cost, construction, program. What we're also now looking at is the impact on an idea around biodiversity. What does it mean for carbon? What does it mean for the type of materials we're going to use? And then ultimately, what does it mean for having more resilient societies and climate change? And all of those aspects are considered alongside the sort of day-to-day business as usual engineering requirements.
To take a slightly different angle, I'd love to say yes, but I still think there's quite a lot of work to do. I think in certain parts of our industry, there's still a lack of sort of real outcome-focused thinking from a very early stage, if I'm being brutally honest. And quite often, as I'm kind of here, as I said, I was an ecologist and an advocate for the ecologists here. There's still too much terminology like environmental constraints, right? So we've all, if we're involved in engineering projects, we hear things like, oh, how do we mitigate these environmental constraints? I think we need to do much more around bringing people in early, sort of with the mindset of what is the outcome we're trying to achieve here, some of the examples you were talking about, so safeguarding, and what is the way to deliver that outcome for both nature, people, and the projects themselves. And that would move us much further away from the point by which we go, we've got a project that we really want to do, and now loads of people have told us that we have to do this and we have to do that, and and it becomes a negative discussion around environment, which still happens, I'm afraid to say, in our industry. So I think it is improving. We do see lots of things being done, lots of mindset shift. But I think we need much more early thinking, early embedding, and opportunity identification, so that those environment and sustainability benefits are embedded right at the beginning, the inception of a project or an idea to deliver, rather than being seen as a blocker or an additional cost or something we're going to have to shoehorn in later.
Yeah. And just on top, I guess on top of the really good points, there's the whole systems piece, there's the whole standards piece, and the language that's used. I think there's also a real need for something around the culture of how everybody operates. When the word ecology is mentioned, what does that trigger inside people? What do people honestly think? Are they thinking, oh no, I've got to do a survey and it's going to block me doing a project? Or are they thinking, we're going to protect nature, that's great for the economy, it's the right thing to do, and it's going to have safety benefits, delivery, blah, 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 blah. And I would suggest that probably there's a small group of people that are in the latter camp, and probably quite a lot of our industry in the former camp, and we need to really work hard, I think, still to build hearts and minds and to just do the right thing. Like, recycling is another good example, isn't it? When you finish your food, what do you do with the packaging? Culturally, we've got a lot better at putting it in the right bin, and I'd say we need to do the same when it comes to the environment.
It's a really interesting point you raised, because in my experience, we're probably quite privileged in that we've probably grown up where we've been quite connected to nature, and so we appreciate it. But I'm very conscious that a large part of society has not had that opportunity to be connected to it, or it doesn't feel comfortable, familiar, and therefore there isn't that empathy or compassion or that drive to relate to it, in terms of society. And yet we know that our health and our wellness is inextricably linked to the health of our land, going back to the soil health, the food production and food security, that system. And I know that Dr. William Bird of Intelligent Health has done quite a lot of work around health and wellness creation and working with communities to get them more active. But what gets people active is not because they're motivated to be healthy and well. It's getting them out in the culture and the place that they identify with, that they feel proud of. And clearly, where we see transport done well in urban environments and integrated sustainably, it is also being cognizant of those cultural points of identity as well and value. So, the question is, is it that we almost, a bit like when we shifted, smoking, we're now living in a very different environment around smoking. That was policy and regulation that made that change. Trying to simply do this as a community of engineers and planners and sustainability experts. Is that enough? Do we need government to actively step more into this space from a regulation and policy point of view? I don't know whether anyone wants to pick up on that.
Well, certainly government has the levers to provide the leadership to enable things to happen. And if it's always just a race to the bottom and do things as cheap as possible, pay lip service to all these things, we're never going to achieve anything. And I think the industry, by showing the good practice that you've all described, showing that there's real benefits to that, doesn't cost that much more, but the actual wider benefits of thinking about nature is critical. Once people see that, it becomes a norm rather than the left of field, and I think that's really important. So it's that conversation, it's that getting that message across to everybody. And I think the point you made is a really important one. There are so many people living in the concrete, urbanized areas are not really seeing nature. Getting them to understand it is important for them, but it's also important for the community, for the society, for our planet is really important. And getting that message across is really, really important. You hear about these people that have never seen the seaside. It's just sad. We need to make people appreciate what a wonderful planet we have.
Yeah, absolutely. And those are people who literally will be living half a mile from the coast, and their children will never have gone to the beach. It's a really tragic circumstance. There is a wonderful paper called "The Sting Is in the Tail" that's been informed by actuarists around the cost of failure to bring resilience right upstream and to think in that systems approach. It's really worth having a look at if you haven't read that. I don't know how we're doing on time, and someone got a watch on. 27 minutes left. Perfect. Brilliant. Brilliant. So if we move on then, I've touched on a number of the aspects here. What else would you think we need to adopt in terms of best practice to enable transport projects to really incorporate decarbonisation and nature-positive interventions?
One of the things we've not really spoken about is the biodiversity net gain, the legislation piece, which I think has really helped us. So I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail on it, but in terms of the UK, working for Ramboll, I come from sort of, the Nordic sort of heritage piece, which you think that, the Nordic, the Scandinavians are all over sustainability. But actually, when it comes to implementation in practice, they don't have the legislation to support it. In the UK, we're unusual in having a piece of legislation around biodiversity and that requirement to enhance biodiversity by 10%. So very simply, you're not just replacing a tree, you're adding more biodiversity to that and making it more diverse is very simply what it's about. But that legislation has really helped kind of drive our approach as well. So it's an example of that is work we've just been done on it's a road development scheme, not a particularly large scheme, changed to around about a couple of spur roads, but the cost of meeting that biodiversity legislation could have been £500,000, which suddenly everybody kind of sits up and goes, we need to take notice of this nature-based thinking piece. And actually part of the role of the design engineer in that was to look at, within our red line boundary, how could we enhance biodiversity? How could we reduce that £500,000 kind of cost and get the biodiversity on site within the red line boundary? So that's very much into the engineering approach and how we look at things. And it's joining together the different disciplines as well. So it's landscape, it's biodiversity with the drainage engineers and the highways engineers all talking that sort of same kind of common language. Yeah.
Can I build on that? So National Highways were effectively an early adopter of biodiversity net gain. So we were required from 2020 to 2025 to achieve no net loss of biodiversity as measured by the BNG metric. And we were given a really tough assumption around the fact that we would lose 1% of biodiversity on our soft estate every year, whatever happened. And a couple of things emerged out of that. However imperfect the metric and however much we're learning, the fact that we were measuring it for our major projects meant, just the way you've been saying, Rachel, that we designed and delivered more carefully and more sensitively, and we lost 2,000 fewer biodiversity units through our construction than we expected to over 5 years. So that's just because we're measuring it and we're being required on it, we're doing better. And the other is we have funded over 6,000 biodiversity units off network, which has allowed us to build really strong partnerships with National Trust, with Plant Life, with wildlife trusts, and so on. And I think has allowed us to build relationships outside and across the country, which is really good. So it seems incredibly positive as a system to me.
Yeah, on the best practice point, I think there's something around it making it easier to do business with environmental things and using the tools that we've done so well in other parts of the industry, digital tools, for example, making it like not needing as much network access to go and do a survey, using thermal imaging equipment, for example, all of that things that just make it easier to do environmental things.
Yes, and there's an opportunity for citizen science as well, which I think is a real route for potentially giving disadvantaged young people an opportunity to play an active part and understand their environment, but also potentially acquire skills and knowledge and those jobs of the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just building on the biodiversity net gain, I think I would completely agree that it has completely changed the conversation, embedded the requirement onto engineers, which is fantastic. And I think where the next step goes is as our industry moves more into fewer major projects, probably, and more into the operation and maintenance space, I think it's going to be really interesting within what you're talking about, Rachel, sort of the red line boundary challenge, going back to the strategic view of how do we broaden our view of our role of the landscape in delivering the biodiversity net gain through improvement of off-site habitats, which then you can then combine with the benefits such as carbon sequestration, the social aspect of giving more communities access to green space, but also protecting the asset in terms of the flood. And I think that's the way things are going to need to go, because I don't think there's going to be enough room in the red line boundary to offset the work that we're going to need to do. So organisations like Network Rail that you touched on, national highways, water companies are going to have to broaden the way they look at their landscape and their relationship with their neighbours to both deliver on those statutory requirements, but also hopefully understand the links between some of the other things that they're trying to achieve in terms of resilience, in terms of social value, in terms of those other things. And I think that's the next step for biodiversity net gain, and I think that's a really exciting moment for our industry, and it's something that I think that will become the best practice beyond just the hitting those BNG points.
Yeah. Can I just mention one more thing as well, just in terms of, you mentioned carbon, and we've sort of gone into a nature-based discussion, but carbon was always the metric and is the metric for measurement of sustainability, and it's great that we haven't really mentioned it. So, but one thing I did want to say was an example from National Highways is where we're not just being set financial budgets now, we're being set carbon budgets, and so that really again makes us as an industry kind of sit up and go, we need to measure carbon, but it's not just about measuring carbon, it's then managing that carbon as well and making that a real positive impact in terms of the materials that we use, etc., and the who does what, the whole requirement. So again, National Highways requires the supply chain to now have PAS 2080, which is a carbon management standard in place for the supply chain, and again that's pushed us into the governance piece. Have we got a role for measurement of carbon and sustainability? Have we set ourselves targets? Are we managing what to do with that number when we've calculated it, and pushing that through right into design and then through into construction and then operation and maintenance?
Yeah. So I think we really have an opportunity with devolution to really think around a regional scale, because we know that tackling and delivering transport infrastructure that is resilient, it goes across statutory boundaries. Politically, there can be challenges around there, but I think there's a real opportunity to think at that regional scale and realise those benefits. as we come to a close as a panel and I move to Q&A, and I'm trying to read my writing even without my glasses on, if you could implement immediately an intervention that would make a difference, what would that be? If I can come to each of you. I don't understand.
Good question. I'll go with collaboration and ownership. And I think something that Steve touched on in terms of who owns this, I think is a massive thing. We've divided the way we manage our infrastructure. In order to do that, we've siloed it up, which means when you have these cross-cutting things around nature and climate resilience, it makes it really difficult. We've divided up by mode, by locality, then by asset type. And when you get onto the ground, it's kind of, is this a geotech problem? Is it an earthworks problem? Is it a drainage problem? So my intervention would be embedding nature and resilience and having sponsorship across this, so that there's people with the ownership in both projects, whether that's routes or regions, to ensure that the way that we design, operate and maintain our infrastructure is cognizant of resilience and nature, because otherwise the risk is it just falls down cracks because it doesn't actually have a true home within our infrastructure management.
Rachel.
Yeah, so sort of stealing part of the roles and responsibilities bit, absolutely. It's making sure that it's demystifying sustainability and environmental issues and having someone that can help with that. So, a coordinator around sustainability or management that tracks through a project and makes it mainstream. So as health and safety was, years ago, it's now having the sustainability bit as, a mainstream kind of issue. There's legislation there, absolutely, we can't ignore it. So communication and reporting, but if we think about, one change, it's thinking about those options. So thinking about that project that I mentioned at the start, the reason that was successful is because the engineer thought we could maybe do something different, and that was because they looked at nature not only as a stakeholder, but almost the client. So what if you looked at nature as a client, would you think differently? And would that give you a different option? So,
one big thing, I'll go down a cultural route. So my one big thing, every single person in the UK that works on an operational contract in the transport sector goes to work tomorrow morning and spends the first hour sat down and each makes 3 commitments for what they're going to do in 2025 to deliver for nature.
Fabulous. Love it, James. Phil.
Okay, I think the first thing is, from what we've seen, nature is very resilient. It will recover if we give it a chance, and so we need to remember that. But I think when we have these large projects, and we've got to think about the resilience of when we have these extremes of weather. It can wipe out an entire area where you've built up nature, so we've got to think about how we can actually deal with that as well, because it may take another 20 years to get back to where it was. We've seen that a few times, but I'm optimistic that we're having these conversations. I'm optimistic that when nature is given a chance, it will recover quite quickly and quite robustly and adapt, and so we just get it right. So keep these conversations going and make sure that we always have in the DNA of any project, thinking about how we can improve on that biodiversity, nature, and just do things a bit smartly. And it's not always following regs, it's not always putting a cost on it, it's just knowing you're doing the right thing, as you said. I think that's really, really important.
Steve.
So I agree. I think nature's a source of optimism. It can feel quite depressing, some of the challenges we've got around carbon and so on. But nature really can rebound and regenerate and be a positive, better future. So I guess regionally, I'd like every region, like Nature North, to have a strategic vision for nature in their region. And let's go make it happen.
Fabulous. So I'm going to bring the panel session to an end and now move to Q&A. So if you have a question for the panel, please raise your hand. And my thoughts into that what's one thing would be around really articulating the trade-offs to inform better decision-making upstream is absolutely fundamental to enabling us to have resilient and effective transport. So any hands? Yes, we have an individual. Please introduce yourself and then ask your question if there's a particular person you'd like it aimed at as well.
Yeah, thanks, Zoe. And yeah, Richard Ward-Jones, from Amey Consulting. I guess the question is, and I think it was alluded to, there's still a perception, probably in the public as well, that nature-based solutions is expensive, it's complex, and things like this £100 million bat shed and 8,000 permits regarding high-speed 2 in the media don't necessarily help that. I guess a question to the panel is how can we do more to actually talk about all the brilliant things that are already happening, and perhaps some of the ideas in this room and in the sector about how we could do much more around kind of nature-based recovery, nature-based solutions. How do we create much more, I guess, of a positive story around this and actually kind of cut through potentially some of that negative media spin?
Who would like to take that? James.
I do know Richard very well, so we'll talk afterwards. I mean, just quick, in anything like, I think it's really important to talk and really highlight the benefits. And I feel like quite a lot of the conversation on nature is around the cost, what needs to be done, legislation and hurdles, and there's not as much noise around benefits. So, you know, when we build that green bridge, what is the benefit of having done it, and how can we really sing about that? You know, how it's helped nature. So that'd be my comment on it. Really, just dial up the noise around benefits and celebrate the success stories more.
I can share a personal story. My home was flooded before Christmas with Storm Bert. It was a rental, fortunately, but it was because of land surcharge. So top of the River Thames and the River Avon, water couldn't flow downstream fast enough. Roads were flooded all around. You know, the roads now are in a terrible state. And we weren't, you know, there's not that integrated thinking around what do we need to do in terms of mitigating those impacts of those climate shocks and sustained rainfall to improve infrastructure. Now, we actually have all the digital data. You know, the Met Office had it, the Environment Agency, but they weren't talking to each other. So we've got to get far better at joining the dots around our data and our infrastructure, and be able to spatially bring that to life. So I think there's a real opportunity with the National Planning Policy Framework and the land use frameworks to better articulate those benefits as well in a spatial way. Got a question here.
Hiya. Lucy Cox, Framework Manager, the Midlands Highways Alliance Plus. From a local authority point of view, do you find that you are having to sort of re-educate local authorities when they talk about sustainability and sort of not talking about carbon necessarily anymore, talking about the environmental aspects? And it's a question for all the panel.
I don't have a huge amount to do with local authorities, but I think the carbon agenda has been so high, and it fits quite nicely because it's so easily measurable, and that's why we've moved towards the biodiversity net gain tool helps, because it's a way of articulating things in a way that people understand with a number on a spreadsheet, which is helpful. But I think there is more conversation needed around the broader sense of sustainability that's been touched upon in terms of the society, economic, as well as the environmental sustainability, and how those things all interrelate. And I think there's a lot more work needs to be done, and there are more tools that are being provided. And I think I keep talking about tools because I think they do help people see things, and there are more tools on the market and being used that bring metrics together that can articulate to local authorities or other infrastructure owners the interrelationships and the benefits of certain interventions. And I think as we see better digital tools, more layering of things like GIS and other things, I think they're much more helpful in helping local authorities and others in how they understand the broader sustainability picture and the interrelationships between all those things.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that, really. And tools do have their place. So carbon has been used as that measurement piece because it's easy-ish to kind of measure carbon in a number of different aspects. But the whole nature piece and the feeling it gives you around that health and well-being, being in nature, how do you measure that? You know, that measurement piece isn't there, but actually people can relate to that much better. You know, going for a walk in a wood, going on the beach, etc., gives people generally a really positive feeling, but it's not measured in the same way. And if you start measuring it in carbon terms, what does that mean to someone? Like you say, it's a number on a spreadsheet. People can't relate to it. So I think that measurement piece we need to get better at for nature. And also, you know, just looking at all of the sort of themes together as well. So, you know, it's carbon, it's materials, it's nature, it's people's well-being, etc. And sort of demystifying the language, really, to put it in kind of common terms. We're not there yet, but yeah, hence carbon.
I think one of the challenges is, and obviously every local authority is different, they're culturally different, their structures are often different. In a time of austerity as well, we've got individuals within local authorities feeling under a lot of pressure and threat. And when are we in threat? We often will, you know, just want to work within our narrow box. Obviously what we're requiring is that systems approach, because it cuts across so many areas of what the local authorities are trying to deliver. So it goes back to helping them make those decisions about trade-offs. But, you know, I know the interfaces I have, it's challenging because it's requiring lots of different parts within a local authority to come together. So you end up trying to mediate and broker and bring together when there's so many other pools and priorities. You know, it's not easy. Do we have another question? Yes.
Yeah, hi. John Lamb. I guess today I'm representing the UK Adaptation, Biodiversity and Climate Board. It's part of the UK Roads Leadership Group, serving all 200 plus highway authorities. And I think without wishing to steal my own thunder on the keynote at 1600, which is focusing on the specific issue that Phil, I think you neatly set the challenge down in terms of the context of Valencia and Belgium, Germany. And the reality is, I guess, that, and it's really sad to hear about your own flooding in a personal context, it gives you a degree of legitimacy, dare I say, that sadly many people have to wait for their own personal epiphany before they get it. And I would just like to understand, how many clients are there in the room? Go on, don't be shy. Okay, so quite a few of us, but not as many. Midlands Highways Alliance, I'd take them as a client as well, to be fair. But isn't it telling 214 highway authorities, all with their own local needs and priorities and issues, all of which are facing their own version of these kind of events? And even if we did have the data, we don't have the capacity to do. And sadly, we're all working through our own personal epiphany to see those kind of events. When I very carelessly lost 6 bridges in Calderdale with Storm Eva, Boxing Day 2015. What I'd like to just try and understand the panel is, how do we make it personal? And within an audience like this, how do we really turn the heat up, if it's heat wave, or let the water start to get up to our knees and the like, before we can actually get people to actually wake up and realise that it is about them, it is now, it's not necessarily just jotting down a few thoughts about what we can do to help the bugs and bats and bees, but they are absolutely part of the mix. But we've got to unfreeze people that we think that we're able to cope with it, because as Stephen has said and others, we've got potentially 50% of our road network that's going to be underwater. How do we actually get people to really understand that in the here and now? Phil, happy if you could kick off on that first, please.
Thanks, John. That's
Okay,
John.
really brief. I mean, first of all, it's not business as usual. I think we've got to accept that the impacts of climate change, the extremes of weather, are going to get worse, more extreme and more regular. And we've got to accept that and actually work out how we actually deal with that. And it's really tricky trying to balance the cost of actually delivering on resilience, adaptation, as well as being conscious of making sure we decarbon. It's a conversation. It's getting that message out to people. I don't want people to only care about it when you get flooded. I'm so sorry to hear that. I can't imagine what it must be like to try and recover from that. So we've got to make sure that people understand that what DARE will do ultimately is deliver a whole set of tools, models that are usable by local authorities, by regional authorities, by civic authorities, and by the industry that have to deliver the solutions. So it's not an academic tool that no one can use. That's the whole point of it. And by doing that, I think we will begin to give you something we can test the what-ifs, look at the trade-offs, etc. We're in the process of engaging with local authorities and regional authorities exactly what they want and what the form of these tools should be, and what training and skills are needed so you can use them. Because the point you made, that local authorities have been pared back to the bare bones, so you don't have massive amounts of expertise. You're lucky to have any expertise in an area, and people need to recognise that, because at the end of the day, it's all being pushed on you now to actually solve these problems and make the decisions. So the more we can do to help inform to make those decisions, the better.
I was just going to quickly, I think we can learn so much from safety in our industry. And we've seen with safety, legislation, personal epiphanies, etc., get to a point and a level of change, and then there has to be something else. And that's all around behaviour. And we've done some fantastic campaigns around behavioural safety and local level things that have happened on construction sites that have made a real difference, whether it's personal charters or boards up in the offices where you've got people talking about their parents and how they want them to come home safe and well, and it's the children that have written these messages and put them on the boards. We don't see that yet for the environment and for nature, and there's a whole raft of things that I think we can do more of out there on our contracts to drive more change and a shift in behaviour.
I also think that sometimes you've just got to make it real, and you actually have to take people to see what the impact has, and they have to feel it. I know with Network Rail, when they were exploring trees and trains, they thought that they could solve that by just being linear and against the railway. We were really quite angry when we said, we took them out in the fields in the pouring rain, saying, no, you need to be thinking differently at this scale with grapes and looking at this slope, and took them back, went back and then looked at geospatial, and they understood that they needed to think differently. But I think sometimes you have to take people out to see it and see how it really impacts people's businesses, their economy, it affects their children, and their access to skills and jobs. You sometimes have to do that. Have we got time for one more question at the back? Yes.
A little bit of disruption here then for you to end. Lisa Levy, market communications consultant. So how do we stop the weaponization against the client in nature sneaking over from the US over to the Europe and to the UK?
Oh, don't look at me.
No, don't do a Robert De Niro on me, okay, Phil, if anyone's seen that clip.
I think we've just got to have a more sensible way of thinking about this. I agree that what's happened in the US in terms of its move away from any of its environmental credentials over the last few weeks is a disaster. We've just got to stand up and show that we can deliver the leadership and we know what are the right things to do.
I'm sorry to say that I think, that we've seen what happened with LA this year, and that was with all of the mitigation measures in place, incredibly equipped federal fire department there. They use all types of high-tech data and digital. Unfortunately, America will experience, worse situations, unfortunately. That's a reality with what's taken place. But yeah, agree, it does have a wider impact around some of our key stakeholders, that we work with, not within local government, but elsewhere in terms of the private sector. So, yeah. Any more questions? Because I'm conscious of time. Well, would you join me in thanking this wonderful panel? I hope you've really enjoyed the diversity of the conversation, and do feel free to follow up with them after the panel now. Thank you very much.